Story 1. The Grinning Stranger. I was house sitting for my grandma one weekend, while she went on a church trip to Florida with her church friends. I had been given the task of looking after her house, which felt comforting, but eerie, especially in the middle of the night. I was staying in the guest bedroom next to her room, which had 2 twin beds. My sister and I used to sleep in them when we had sleepovers at Grandma's house, but tonight, it was just me. I took the bed next to the window, a spot I was familiar with, but I made sure to check all the doors to ensure they were locked before crawling under the covers. The house felt unusually quiet, and there wasn't much to do in the stillness. So I ended up lying in bed scrolling through my phone, watching videos and texting people to pass the time. It was around midnight when I began hearing something unsettling. After about an hour, I started hearing something unusual outside. It sounded like a woman's voice, calling out, "Hello." I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, so I left the guest bedroom cautiously, creeping towards the front door. As I moved closer to the front door, the voice became clearer. It was coming from just outside the house. My grandma's front door didn't have a peephole, but the dining room windows gave a perfect view of the porch. I tiptoed over to the window, trying to stay out of sight, but it must have been too late, because when I looked through, I saw a woman standing on the stoop, her eyes locked on mine. The moment our gazes met, she smiled this unnerving, unsettling grin, like she had been waiting for me to look through those blinds. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. She was an older woman, probably in her late 50s or early 60s. But something about her face, it just didn't sit right. It wasn't that she was necessarily ugly. It was her expression too wide of a smile, her eyes too vacant. She looked like she knew something I didn't. I tried to look away, but she didn't stop. She kept saying, "Hello," over and over, with that same disturbing smile plastered on her face, never breaking eye contact. I quickly stepped back from the window, my heart racing. Maybe she was just one of Grandma's friends, but why was she standing out there at midnight? Why wasn't she knocking on the door? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I returned to the guest bedroom, locked the door, and tried to calm myself. For a while, I didn't hear anything. The silence helped me relax, and I texted my sister about the strange woman. My sister told me to call Grandma, but I knew she was probably asleep and wouldn't answer. After a few minutes of calm, though, something broke the silence. There was a loud bang at the window. Not a knock, but a hard thud that made me jump out of my skin. Before I had time to think, that same unsettling voice said, "Hello," again, as if she hadn't left. I was filled with panic, my heart pounding. I grabbed the blinds and yanked them up. There, right outside the window, was the woman's face, just inches from the glass. She smiled again, wide and creepy, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling recognition, like she knew exactly what she was doing. I screamed in terror and told her I was calling the cops. Her smile didn't falter. She just stood there, as if she didn't care about my threat. I rushed away from the window, heart pounding. I ran upstairs to the second guest bedroom and locked myself in. I couldn't bring myself to call the cops right away. I didn't know if she was dangerous or just mentally ill, but I felt safer hiding in the room. I stayed under the covers, too scared to move, praying that this would all stop. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the image of her face from my mind. Finally, around dawn, I summoned enough courage to go downstairs and check the windows again. The woman was gone. There was no sign of her outside, and I felt a slight wave of relief. Still, the tension in my chest remained. I called my grandma to tell her about what happened, expecting her to brush it off, but when she answered the phone, she sounded panicked, her voice shaky as she shouted into the receiver. She told me that, just a few days before, she had been followed by a woman in the grocery store, a woman who kept smiling at her for no apparent reason. I tried to calm her down, but I couldn't ignore how distressed she sounded. It was impossible not to consider the possibility that the woman outside my grandma's house was the same person. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. My grandma is 75 and has had a few lapses in her memory, so I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But something about the whole situation, the woman's voice, the strange behavior, her unsettling smile, still haunted me. I kept wondering if it could have been the same person, watching both of us for some unknown reason.
Story 2. The figures in the backyard. It was a typical night. I had just returned from an evening at my sister's house, where we'd watched movies and shared laughs with her friends. The moon was barely visible behind the clouds, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. As I pulled into the driveway, my heart felt light, unaware that the night would soon take a dark turn. I climbed out of my car and saw the familiar glow of my mother's porch light shining through the window. She had left a note on the front door, reminding me to take the garbage cans out to the curb. I sighed, exhausted but dutiful, and walked to the side of the house. The trash cans were by the back gate, a little too far for my liking. As I moved toward them, something caught my eye: movement in the backyard. I froze. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but it seemed like someone was lurking just out of sight behind the bushes. My instinct screamed that something was wrong. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard it: a whisper. A faint voice, barely audible, but definitely there. My heart skipped a beat. I thought about going inside, but my curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously peered over the side of the fence. What I saw sent a chill straight to my bones. Two figures stood near our patio table, their backs turned to me. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, motionless. But something about them felt wrong, like they weren't supposed to be there. My breath caught in my throat as my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Fear overcame me, and I turned to run back into the house. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something scrape against the ground, followed by footsteps approaching the stairs. The figures had moved. They were heading toward the front door. Panicked, I ran inside, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. My pulse raced as I rushed to my mom's room, my hands trembling as I knocked frantically. "Mom," I whispered loudly, desperate to wake her without alerting whoever was outside. She stirred, gradually sitting up, and I explained what I'd seen. Her face drained of color. Without hesitation, she pushed the covers aside and got out of bed. "We need to go."
"Now," she whispered, her voice shaking. She grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the window. I barely had time to process what was happening before she opened the window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge. "Come on," she urged, holding her hand out to me.
With no other option, I crawled out after her, the cold night air biting at my skin. My heart was pounding in my chest as we carefully made our way down the ledge, clinging to the sides of the house. We didn't speak, both of us fully aware of how fragile the situation was. Just as we reached the ground, I heard the door of the house creak open. The figures had reached the front door. They were coming inside. We could hear them moving through the house, their footsteps sounding unnervingly deliberate. My mom's grip tightened around my wrist as we sprinted toward the street, adrenaline pumping through me. We had to get away. The feeling of being hunted washed over me as we ducked behind a neighbor's parked car. We held our breath, hoping they wouldn't notice us. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the figures left the house. They weren't satisfied with just entering. It was as though they were looking for something or someone. They disappeared into the night, their shadows blending with the darkness. We waited, still hidden behind the car, until my mom's breath returned to normal. "Stay here," she whispered. "I'm going to call the police." But before she could make the call, the phone rang. The number was unlisted, and the eerie silence that followed made my skin crawl. My mom hesitated, then picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was distorted, faint. It sounded almost like a whisper, but clear enough to send chills through me. "Why didn't you pick up?" the voice asked. My mom froze. Her face paled as she stared at the phone. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the line went dead. The phone clicked off, leaving a silence so thick I could almost taste it. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she read the words. "Why didn't you pick up?" We frozen, terrified. The silence in the air was suffocated. My mother dropped the phone, held my hand tightly, and we both ran out the front door, desperate to escape whatever was happening. I didn't look back. Not once. All I could think was that I had to get away with my mother, but the chilling thought lingered in my mind. Who were they? And why were they watching me?
Story 3. Behind the glass. I don't know why I looked up. Maybe it was the rustling of the leaves or a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. But when I did, I saw him. He stood there, right against my window, like he was part of the shadows. His forehead pressed against the glass, his eyes wide, still, and unblinking, the light from the living room casting an unnatural glow on his face. He wore a cartoonish grin, bright red like lipstick, a smile that didn't belong in the real world. I froze, my heart pounded in my chest as I stared at him, unable to look away, unable to move. I was out in the yard, pruning the bushes, but it felt like I was paralyzed, locked in place. My wife was upstairs, asleep, and my son was in his crib. The world seemed to hold its breath. He didn't speak, just stood there, staring through the window at me, his smile never wavering. Then, slowly, his hand came up, and with unnerving precision, he slid it down the glass, watching me. His hand left a trail of condensation on the window, like he was marking me, like he knew I was watching him. I could barely breathe, my throat tightening with fear. The matted hair that hung in front of his face made his features look distorted, like something pulled from a nightmare. I didn't dare move. My feet were still in the bushes, my body stiff and cold. My mind screamed for me to run, to scream for help, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. His yellow skin, sickly and raw, glistened faintly in the dim light of the room behind me. He wasn't just a man, he was a thing that didn't belong here, and I was too terrified to know what he wanted. He pressed closer to the window, his face nearly flattening against the glass, still smiling that grotesque grin. His eyes didn't blink, his eyes didn't move. They stayed locked on mine, deep and hollow, as if they could see into my very soul. I should have gone inside, should have run to my wife, to my son. But all I could do was stand there, frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. What was he? Who was he? What did he want? The silence stretched on forever, and I could feel the darkness creeping around me, tightening its grip. Then, slowly, the thing at the window began to move, but not like a person. It was as if the world around him twisted and warped with each step he took. He slid away from the glass, his body melting into the shadows. I thought for a moment that he was gone, that the nightmare had ended, but as I turned to run, I saw it, the reflection in the glass. There, just behind me, was the same grin, the same yellow skin, the same unblinking eyes.